5 to 10% of the population here in New York City is electing the leaders for the 90% of us who are not bothering to vote. A lot of that has to do with the primary system, right? The Democrats ultimately are going to win out in the general election because everybody just rubber stamps it and doesn't think about it. But what really matters here is the primary, and you have closed primaries, and they happen with very little fanfare. The progressives have mobilized extremely successfully, and they put up the most radical guy they can. They call themselves Democrats, they're socialists. And by the time the general comes around, nobody knows what happened. They just know they voted Democrat, and they're just not paying attention, right? So they don't realize that 5-10% of their district, of their city, is making decisions for the rest of us, and that also needs to be conveyed.
Hello, Culminators. Today, as I sit to you in my Newark, New Jersey office, looking out the window at the picturesque site of the overbuilt west side of Manhattan, I am city of my birth. I am pleased to have with us today someone who still lives in New York and is doing his darndest, along with a number of other people, to make sure that it is possible for people to still live in New York. His name is Brian Robinson. He's a former Democrat who has come to the conclusion that there's nothing Democrats can do that's good for cities, certainly for New York City, where he lives. Someone who has interacted with me on Twitter since before the 2022 election, through a mutual friend of ours who, given his wily ways, probably would prefer not to be named, although anyone with a brain who could figure it out quite easily, who cared. This is Brian Robinson, and he's going to tell us a story about trying to push for mainstream, moderate, common sense change in New York City. Good morning, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Ron. It's actually incredible how difficult common sense is in this city.
How uncommon
it is. I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much. It is an honor. It's my journey into politics was not expected. I never had any career aspirations to be in politics. It's one of those things when you feel like the city you love is going to hell. You move out, which, trust me, I've thought about it, or you fight back. And right now I'm fighting back, and it's a tough one. I tried originally to run as a Democrat, as a disruptor, because I saw how ridiculous they've become and how far left radical it's come here. Like, they're unrecognizable. I remember when Democrat didn't mean what it means now. So
certainly not.
Yeah. So that was unsuccessful, although I tried, because they are very much in their new element, and they do not want to change. Their trajectory is very much locked and loaded, and the only way to really fight this fight is to join the saner party, which is the Republicans. And that's
so let's take a step back. Tell us about your background, what you were when you thought you would lead a normal life, a non-political life.
Okay. So, I was a philosophy major. I ended up in finance. I graduated Tulane University, started up in New York about 16 years ago.
So you're not originally from New York?
No, I'm not. I'm from New Jersey.
Whereabouts?
Homedale, Central.
Sure.
Yeah. You live in Jersey, don't you, Ron?
Yes, and I spent most of my life, even though I lived in Brooklyn until I was 9 years old. People say, where did you grow up? How do you answer that question when you grew up in one place till you were 9? And another, so for most people in the country, as far as they're concerned, it may as well be the same place. They couldn't care less. New York, New Jersey. But if you're from New York, it's a hell of a big difference.
Oh, yeah, it certainly is. It certainly is. And I can't claim to be born and raised, but I think if you've been here 16 years, you can steadily say that you are a New Yorker.
Sure.
You know, the
Especially the last 16 years.
yes, especially the last 16 years to have stayed has taken quite the resilient skill set
And commitment.
and commitments. But yeah, you know, pretty ordinary. I'm a writer, which is neither here nor there, but I've made my living in finance. I ran a small business for 12 years. I met my wife at a bar, you know, we got married. She's amazing. We now have 2 kids. I have a newborn. He was born a month ago. And
Mazel.
thank you. Thank you. And you know, it's the pandemic hit, and I just saw a level of irrationality from the institutions that govern us that frankly made me sick. I was horrified. I was angry, and it was not healthy for me really to hold on to the anger that I had for, you know, closing the schools and not letting my daughter go to school for over a year, and wearing the masks far past any justification for that. The toddler mask mandate, which was downright dystopian, they made her wear a mask while the rest of us didn't have to. I mean, if you can imagine it, if you're not from New York City, only the 2 to 4 year olds had to wear masks for about 4 months, while the rest of us didn't have to wear a mask. And it was so silly because the science didn't support it at all. And yet
And it was punctuated by the Black Lives Matter, the massive demonstration for after the George Floyd murder,
yeah,
or killing, which masks were not necessarily a feature, and certainly social distancing was not. So there was never a scientific. There was really never a good faith scientific claim for it. That's not our topic. The point is, it was insanity in New York.
no, I mean, what you're saying is right, though, because in the middle of lockdown and wear a mask and you're a bad person if you don't, you're having massive protests for a month where masks aren't really the priority and everybody can congregate and do what they want. And it's kind of like, oh, you know, science bends for social justice, right? It's like we'll make an exception, dependent on, you know, what the behavior of what everybody's doing. And it's just
And
like,
Bill de Blasio says this with a full heart. You know, I mean, he looks right into the camera and says, "This was just too significant of a moment." What? To not kill grandma? To not kill everyone in the city?
right.
What do you mean? It was.
Yeah, the inconsistencies were
And they were sending cops, of course, into businesses in Brooklyn. I was involved, you know, in that moment, you know, when they felt that maybe a lawyer could help, and we figured out pretty soon a lawyer couldn't help because the judges were insane also.
yeah. The judges continue to be insane, and they continue to contribute to the downfall of New York City with, you know, letting criminals out on the streets who have been arrested 40 or so times. I know some of that, or a lot of it, has to do with state law and dangerousness, but we've seen a lot of silly inconsistencies out of judges in New York.
So
That
what kind of how is it that such insanity is being elected and reelected in New York City? I mean, we're not talking about San Francisco, which has a tradition of radicalism.
Mhm.
There have always been some precincts in New York that have been funkier than others, but traditionally, you know, it was an FDR kind of LBJ, old-fashioned Democrat coalition sort of situation. And then that seems to have just unraveled.
Yeah, George Floyd, I think, had a lot to do with it, because the more radical notions like defund the police became more mainstream because people were too afraid to talk, reasonable people, and politicians were pushing some of these insane criminal reforms that probably never would have been pushed through before George Floyd, but there was that window, that moment during COVID, right after George Floyd, where everything the socialists ever wanted to do, they did. And people shut up about it because they were called racists, white supremacists, if they had anything to say about maybe bail reform's not the best idea, or maybe we should be consistent about our mask standard. Either we're wearing them or we're not making exceptions for Black Lives Matter. The villainy of the mob was heavy at that time, and you couldn't say anything. A lot of
And you
people
were, and as a
did.
Democrat, right? You're because you're, of course, you're a Democrat. You're in New York.
Mhm.
You know, you're a liberal, open-minded guy. You're not in favor of all the things that supposedly Republicans are bad for being famous for, or famous for being bad for. And you're around people who are cowed by the mob. In other words, it's one thing for there to be a mob. It's another thing for a mob to find a receptive audience that will, that will bend the knees, even to the extent where I remember one thing I said was, this stuff that's going on isn't going to happen in New York because the NYPD isn't like that. And it wasn't as bad in New York as it was in many other places. But what we saw was that the NYPD is pretty much like that.
Or their hands are tied. I think in a lot of ways, the NYPD just can't do their job. Because, all right, you have a guy who's been arrested 20, 30 times and it's number 31. Do they bother to arrest him again? Is their work fulfilling? Are they sick of being called Nazis and white supremacists merely for standing on the corner and trying to keep the neighborhood safer? I mean, I think they just gave up in a way. I think they were demoralized. I don't think the NYPD is for any of these radical notions. I think they're just kind of like, all right, you don't want us to do what we used to do to keep this city one of the safest in the country anymore. You want us to let it go to hell? Then fine, we'll stand around. We'll let that happen.
Brian, I went to a conference, I guess it was 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, in Atlanta. And I came back to the hotel in the evening, maybe at 8, 9 o'clock, maybe it's after 9. And I said, where's the closest convenience store? I'd like to pick up a couple of things. I asked the guy at the door at the hotel, and he said, well, X number of blocks. And I said, okay. He says, whoa, this isn't New York City. You can't walk there at this hour.
Right.
And so I grew up in New York in the late 60s and 70s, when it was going through the precipitous decline of that era, which is why we didn't stay in New York City. And it was hard for me to understand until that moment that New York had now been, by the 90s or the early part of this century, regarded as an incredibly safe place where you could practically go anywhere at any hour. Mm-hmm. And we all used to take the subways. It was a golden era.
It certainly was, and we've lost it. We've let it go. We've willingly taken an amazing era of safety and flushed it down the toilet. I mean, I heard stories about the 70s and 80s in the city. I wasn't there, but
all you have to do is look at one of those pictures of people sitting on a subway.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrifying. I mean, it was so menacing. It wasn't actually, it was, we conservatives are very contemptuous of this formula that equates words with, or expression with, violence. But the subway cars in that era were violence.
Just you mean the graffiti?
I'm saying it was a violent assault on your sensibilities.
Yeah,
and like it was menacing. Sitting on just being in that environment was menacing, and that's pretty much, I mean, now what we have is literally menacing people, and we're not. And that seems to be completely understood as an acceptable state of affairs in New York, in the subways.
Yes, and I agree with that, and I think the common thread there is the idea of what can happen at any point in time, right? What can happen? I'm sitting here. Who's going to attack me? What kind of mentally ill, psychotic person is going to confuse me for, I don't know, the person who is responsible for the destruction of the earth in 10 days and 4 seconds? And, it's like, these people, I remember when Michelle Go was pushed tragically to her death in the subway by someone who was mentally ill and very well known to be mentally ill and should have been institutionalized a long time ago. He was screaming something like, "I am God." I mean, I can't even imagine what in his head Michelle Go represented. But what I can take from that is that everybody is afraid because you've got people who are attacking others randomly, and it's because of what's going on in their own heads, right? Or they're just angry and they know they can get away with it, right? I think there's an element to that too. There's no consequences for beating somebody up, right? So, you've got two sides of the token.
There was a reaction to this.
Yeah.
In the 80s, Rudolph Giuliani was elected mayor, and
Yes.
we had already moved out, but it was a really exciting moment because there was actually support for the idea that someone could take back the city, that the middle class, that working people, and not only working people, but professionals, people who, like yourself, who wanted to live in the city and who had a choice, would once again have the opportunity to live in the city in the manner in which it was intended. That's not happening now. That, I don't think anyone thinks that's even remotely possible. Giuliani at the time was a liberal Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, to the extent that he was a Republican at all, it probably had as much to do with the fact that, well, I guess he had been appointed by a Republican president to the U.S. Attorney's job. So he had been a Republican. But what are the chances for Republicans to have any impact politically in the 21st century?
Right
words,
now, it's the moment.
You're not running for mayor, and
No.
you don't have the the profile that Rudy Giuliani did, when he ran against David Dinkins after his disastrous one term.
Oh yeah. I see what you're saying, though.
Yeah, I mean,
the time is now. We need to take the city back, and I really hope there's enough popular support for taking it back, as there was in the Giuliani era, because if we don't start showing up and voting for common sense people, the decay is gonna persist.
But I think I think a lot of people believe that isn't possible now the way it was 25 years ago, because the middle class base, the does simply isn't there in the city anymore. Is that true?
I think it's complicated. I do think that the city has displaced the middle class to a large extent, and that is certainly regrettable. For those who are holding on, they're not happy. But I think even for those who may not fit that profile are upset with what they see. People are getting attacked, and nobody likes that. They know the city's not safe, and the Democrats are less and less successful lying about how safe the city is. Everybody knows at this point the city's not safe. And when you have, for instance, I'm running for city council against a guy who wants to strip the rights of a landlord to conduct criminal background checks on potential tenants. Now, I don't care if you're your, regular liberal guy who's voted Democrat their entire life and would never consider voting otherwise. Did you ask for that? Did you ask to potentially live in the building with somebody who murdered somebody 20 years ago, or if you're Jewish, somebody who beat up, to near death a Jewish guy back in the day, but has done his time and now is, in theory, paid his debts to society. No, I think if you're capable of that type of action, you're capable of that type of action. Again, call me cynical. And, we've reached the point where if you want the city to exist, if you want your apartment to be worth anything, if you want to walk the streets and potentially not get stabbed that day, you have to make a different decision at some point. At some point, you have to say enough is enough. I'm going to go with the guy who's a Republican, hate Republicans, whatever. He is not crazy. But what we're seeing right now is crazy. The Roosevelt Hotel, they're turning into a migrant intake center on the east side. We paid almost 250 million, I think, to the Pakistani government in order to purchase that property, which is another issue we don't have time to wrap our heads around right now. In order to house the migrants that are coming across the border and give them food, give them medicine, send them to school, and these are things that local politicians are authorizing. So I think if the change can happen anywhere, it's on the local level. It's to say, all right, my city councilman's lost it, right? So maybe we'll try this other guy.
So let's talk. There. So you mentioned that you agree with my proposition, which is that the middle class has been really undermined in the city.
Yes.
Would you not agree that to a large extent, the reason for that is because of policies involving housing that were not necessarily the result of radical left politicians, but which have been part of the willingness to let developers run housing and construction and zoning policy in New York City for the last 20 years. I mean, de Blasio, look at how overbuilt the West Side is, and these ridiculous space needles that they're putting, which are empty.
Yeah.
Although people own the apartments, they're empty because they're investment vehicles.
Yes.
But it is just a known thing that there is no middle class. The middle class simply can't live in certainly in Manhattan, and unless you're living in a rent controlled building, in which case that's been a disastrous long-term effect on things. Also, if you were elected to city council, I guess job one would be just stopping the tidal wave of insanity. But is there a long-term vision that says Mike Bloomberg is not really the model for a long-term sustainable rebuilding, as much as his mayor, he was mayor during this golden era. I can't deny that. He was a good mayor. He was out of touch in his third term, which every third term seems to have that quality. It was the same thing with Ed Koch. But is there a sort of more market-oriented vision that you think is practical to implement in New York City for managing the sociological issues?
I do think, I'm a free market guy, and
how are you ever a Democrat? Because you were in New York, that's why.
Say it again.
Then how are you ever a Democrat?
Well, I was an independent before I was a Democrat.
I see. Okay. Oh, in other words, you were a Democrat because you wanted to run for office.
Yes.
And there's only one party in New York, presumptively.
Well, and I thought I could disrupt. I thought that I could maybe be a voice of reason, and that's just not happening. But yeah, I've always been an independent, and I've voted Republican in the past.
Okay, so I interrupted you. I'm sorry. You were saying in answer to my question, you're a free market guy.
Yes, I'm a free market guy. I think developers do have influence that goes beyond what's reasonable, because what they're doing is they've got they profit off building these affordable housing units, and they pretty much control a lot of the politicians, the progressive politicians, and their decisions on upzoning, on rezoning. So you've got two crops of new developments, right? It's either affordable housing or it's these space needles, and there is no in between anymore. And I've seen when you look at the bills of what a lot of the city council members are pushing, including the Keith Powers, who I'm running against, half of them are for rezoning, upzoning. So the real estate money is tied to it. And I do think that the influence of it needs to be curtailed in order to let a free market, more natural developments reign free. I do think if that happened, then you'll see more naturally affordable housing, not affordable like we're giving people apartments, but rents can come down because we're building, normal buildings for normal people, not necessarily, not these luxury sky rises all over the place. I think we can level the playing field if we remove the influence of developers. Frankly, developers and politicians are hand in hand these days, especially the progressive politicians.
And isn't so that's rather ironic, right? You would think that that would be a way for you to speak to, less insane progressives and say, listen, why are you letting billionaires, why are you voting for politicians who are controlled by billionaire developers? That doesn't resonate.
Yeah, how progressive is that? It should resonate. They don't know. They don't know. I mean, part of the problem with New York City and how it's come to this is that 10%, really less, 5 to 10% of the population here in New York City is electing the leaders for the 90% of us who are not bothering to vote. A lot of that has to do with the primary system, right? The Democrats ultimately are going to win out in the general election because everybody just rubber stamps it and doesn't think about it. But what really matters here is the primary, and you have closed primaries, and they happen with very little fanfare. The progressives have mobilized extremely successfully, and they put up the most radical guy they can. They call themselves Democrats. They're socialists. And by the time the general comes around, nobody knows what happened. They just know they voted Democrat, and they're just not paying attention, right? So they don't realize that 5-10% of their district, of their city, is making decisions for the rest of us. And that also needs to be conveyed, on top of the fact that, yes, it's not progressive for progressive politicians to be in bed with big real estate. I mean, there's a lot that just comes down to lack of knowledge. People just don't know what's going on, and it's an uphill battle to teach them.
So what are you doing? How are you going to try to do that? Like you said, there's a lack of education. People somehow they're not involved in the nitty-gritty of the politics part. How are you going to get that message across? Yes, you say people know that it's unsafe, but do they know that there's a choice in the ballot booth? You're saying that they don't.
They don't know. And like I said, it is difficult to convey that point. So I focus on things like public safety because that affects everybody, and people know it's a huge problem, and it's a huge problem for me.
What's your district? Describe your district.
My district is City Council District 4. It's the east side of Manhattan. It starts at Stuytown, and then you go up. You have Midtown East. You've got Koreatown in there. You have the Upper East Side to about the 90s, west of 3rd Avenue to the park.
So this is a fairly sophisticated district in terms of education, income, social class. It is an overwhelmingly white district. You say Koreatown, but most of the Koreans in Koreatown do not live in Koreatown. That is a commercial district.
Yep. And we have Sutton Place.
Sutton Place, which is historically where New York's politicians have lived. You should be able to get the message across to people with this kind of background.
Yes, they're responding to me. They are. It's going well. It's just about getting in front of people, which we're working on. I mean, right now the primaries haven't even started yet. I go straight to the general. They tried to kick me off. They got one of Biden's lawyers to actually show up and boot me off the ballot, but that didn't work. So there will be a general election, and yeah, insane. What you're saying is right, is that there are smart people in my district, and actually it's many are saying that it's the only winnable district for a Republican in Manhattan. And what the numbers are there. Last time around, the Republican candidate who ran got 5,000 votes and didn't even run a campaign. From what I'm told, didn't have an email. And we have determined that we need, yeah, seriously, we need 8,000 votes to win. That's our threshold.
That's amazing.
5,000 is built in. Keith Powers, the guy I'm running against, he's powerful in that he's the majority leader, but he's unpopular and he doesn't have much of a base because he was a lobbyist before he was a politician. He doesn't have that grassroots reach out. He just kind of slid into victory and never had any real opponent. So I am having those conversations with people. We're talking about how progressives are hypocritical. We're talking about how their city councilman is pushing the most insane bills you could ever think of. I mean, we're trying, Ron, we are trying.
Now, are there lessons for you to learn from the success of Ina Vernikov, or is her situation so unique because of the Russian factor and the Orthodox Jewish factor in Brooklyn?
Yep.
Or is there something that you can learn from that?
Well, there's a lot of Jews on the Upper East Side, and as a Jew, they're more open to listening to what I have to say. And I've been actually just the other day I was over at Chabad, and I went to a service there, and they let me speak afterward. And Jews in particular have been targets of violent hate crimes, more than anybody in this city, any type of person. And
from white supremacists, though, right? That's what.
Yeah, it's the white supremacists. It's the guys in the Trump hats that you never see in the city. They only come out at night when there's no cameras. No, I mean, we all know that it's other minorities that are punching Jews in the face and ripping off their yarmulkes and assaulting them, frankly. And we have the stats to prove it. And we have a DA who won't give a guy who beat the hell out of a guy who I'm talking about, the guy who was out there to support Israel. They took crutches and they beat him in the face with them. They pepper sprayed him. They broke his jaw. He's a basketball player. His wrist is all screwed up now. He was eligible for 8 years in prison, and Bragg gave him a plea deal of 6 months. So the government's not working for our people right now in New York City. That's obvious. Otherwise, hate crimes against Jews, violent ones, wouldn't be up 300-400% since 2019.
But a lot of the people in your district they're not going on the subway, right? They're not, they tend to be well-off people who, I mean, isn't there this problem? I know this is a problem in San Francisco, that the people who vote for progressive candidates that make streets unsafe are not personally directly affected by the unsafeness of the streets. I think that's less so in New York.
I think it's less so because, I mean, if we're still talking about Jews, if you're wearing a yarmulke, you're a target on the streets as much as you're a target down in the subway. We had the statistics will verify that.
But I mean, my experience in the New York area is that progressive Jews are not particularly sympathetic to Jews who wear yarmulkes.
They're not. And that's unfortunate. And my message is one of unity, because if they're going after, I see it as it should be one big family. If they're going after our brothers and sisters in yarmulkes, they're going to come for you next. And they don't like you to begin with, because even if there's a lot of liberal people, liberal Jews who do support Israel. And this new regime of progressives are very anti-Israel, and they make it very difficult for even mainstream liberal Jews to voice any support for it. So there's a chasm there that I think will grow larger. And I think this is a critical point, to tell regular liberal Jews, not the 10% progressive Marxist Jews that are, like Jay Fredge, but, the 90% that can be with us. It's a common sense message of, listen, this government's not for you. They're not the liberals they used to be. And they are not only are they not representing you, they don't like you, right? If you like Israel, even, I'm not talking about having criticisms of Israel like you can have criticisms of any government. I'm saying, like, if you have your heart, if you're a Zionist, or you love Israel, or you support Israel, and you're a liberal, which there's a lot of them, they don't like you. And, culturally, they're trying to destroy you, with a lot of what's happening in education, a lot of what's happening in, this Marxist pseudo-intellectualism. It's not just the Orthodox Jews that are in trouble here. It's regular Jews, that liberal, non-Orthodox Jews.
And it's non-Jews as well. I mean, I'm always amused with myself when I'm in the city around Christmas time, and I see all the Christmas trees in the windows in the apartments, and I think, you might well think that this is a Jewish city. Guess what? It's an American city with Jews in it.
Yep.
American Jews. It's a very, and historically there have been tensions. I mean, my father told me, growing up in the Lower East Side in the 30s, Italian kids were coming down one side of the street and the Jewish kids coming down the other side of the street. The Jewish kids moved to the other side of the street. They knew what was good for them. But I find it very intriguing that you, as an adopted New Yorker, because I understand, I always say, people who listen regularly will have heard me say this before, that loving New York is like loving an alcoholic family member.
Yes.
They're a wreck, and they're in constant decline, but you still love them, and every time I'm in the city, as wretched as it is, my heart pang, I still feel that attachment, and it's just so tragic to see what's going on. So I can't tell you how much I personally, I can, but no one really wants to hear it, appreciate the efforts that you're making, and I hope that that you'll get people to listen.
I'm trying, and I appreciate your help with that. I think the stage I've set up for this race, kind of building off the relationships that I've made off the last race, and frankly, I do have the media's attention at this point, and I'm going to parlay that into my message, just project it louder, which is common sense, public safety, and getting people to realize that their progressive councilmen or their progressive representatives are not actually representing them, and they're doing things really to the antithesis of their well-being. So I appreciate it, Ron. I appreciate your support. I've always appreciated it, and
I'm happy
our best.
I'm happy to extend it. We see what's happening in Chicago, which is, really looks like a lost cause. DC, the cities in the Pacific Northwest, it's phenomenal. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, further down. I mean, cities, I understand better than I ever did the Jeffersonian discomfort with cities and the people of cities, but they are pretty much, the modern world. You can't, the world can't be sustained by the suburbs, which is a different kind of toxicity, and rural life is extremely important, and it's not, and it is looked at with contempt by many people. And you grew up in a relatively rural part of New Jersey.
I did.
People don't appreciate that the Elizabeth refineries are not representative of the entire state of New Jersey.
Right.
But there's something about New York that is worth saving, in my opinion. I thank you for your efforts in doing that, and hopefully we help you get the message out.
Thanks, Ron. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
Yep. Thank you.